Hey, this is Buddy Levy, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, cool. I'm having technical difficulties today, but that's all right. I get a chance to talk to one of my favorite authors. Buddy, I love your books, man. I love them. I love them. I love them. They're so great. And you know what you think we know about David Crockett? Well, now we know a lot more because we can read your book. Matter of fact, I found it. It's right here. There it is. And my screen is reversed, so let me get that changed. But yeah, thanks for coming on the show, man, and talking about your wonderful book.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Pete. A couple times now, if maybe third. So I really appreciate your continued readership, and hopefully we'll get some folks to know more about an amazing American icon.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. I also have with us, for you guys who don't know already, that's Ron Jackson down below. Let's bring Ron to the big screen. Ron wrote a book about the Alamo, which is part of the David Crockett. It's actually the end of the David Crockett story. So, Ron, introduce yourself and tell us real quickly about your book, and then we'll go forward from there.
Yeah, Ron Jackson, and I've written 6 books to date, all historical narratives, nonfiction historical narratives. And the book I did on the Alamo was Joe the Slave Who Became an Alamo Legend. And that came out in 2015. So anyway, and I'm thrilled to be here with Buddy because he did a book on someone who's one of my favorite historical characters. So,
yeah. Well, let's give you the first question, Ron.
Well, I guess it's kind of a simple one, but maybe not so simple. But what drew you to Crockett in the first place? Because a lot of people have done a lot of literature on Crockett, and I'm kind of just curious, what drew you to him, buddy?
Yeah, man, that's a great question, and it's a little bit of a lengthy response. But if you'll humor me for a second, I actually call myself an accidental historian because and this book Crockett was the initial accident, like the real accident. But I grew up in Ketchum, Idaho, and I grew up with a father from New Orleans, Louisiana, who had spent a great deal of time hunting in the swamps and bayous and near the Gulf and down there. And he taught me how to hunt when I was really young. And I was actually, I had a degree in creative writing and was I wrote a lot of natural history, and but I was trying to get an agent, and I had sent this agent named Scott Waxman this book about hunting. Actually, it's my first book was about hunting this elusive game bird called the chucker partridge, which is a pretty obscure introduced game bird. Anyway, so this agent was like, he loved the book. Then he got on the phone with me and he said, and he called me and I was out hunting, and I picked up my old flip phone back in the day, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm actually going bird hunting. I've got my dogs in the car. And he's like, man, you really love hunting, don't you? And I said, yeah, I mean, I've been doing it since I was like 7 years old. And he said, well, who's the greatest hunter in American history? And I said, well, that's got to either be Daniel Boone or David Crockett. And
right.
Like, he goes, well, write a book about one of those guys. So I dug into the research, and like you say, Ron, it was quite daunting because I saw that there were reams of books written about both of these guys.
Both guys. Yeah.
But what I realized was that the most recent, and this was back in 03 or something, that the most recent full-fledged biography that had been written on Crockett had been about 40 or 50 years before. So I told my agent that, and he said, well, there are new audiences all the time, so dig in and see what you think. And once I started reading Crockett's autobiography, I was just hooked. He was so funny and interesting, and a yarn spinner. And I wrote a proposal about Crockett, and it managed to go with the publisher Penguin Putnam back in the day. And that was like why it was an accident, because I hadn't really been thinking about Crockett or narrative history, actually, and that launched a career for me, really. So I have a great deal of affection for David Crockett.
Yeah. He was one of the. I was always fascinated with the guy because he was an absolute American icon and legend before he even stepped foot in Texas. Now I was wondering if
Oh
you could
yeah.
touch a little bit on that, because I know you did a lot of research on the whole cradle to grave thing. So I mean, before he even gets to
Yeah.
Texas, tell me what you found. What was the person you found there?
Oh man, it is so interesting because yeah, like Crockett gets known for the Alamo, but I mean, and talk about accidents. I mean, really, he sort of bumbled into Texas in a lot of ways. I mean, that had not been his grand plan. But the guy, much of his life and career, that is fascinating, takes place all before he ever, as you say, steps foot in Texas. Because when he finally heads to Texas after losing his last election for Congress in 1835, he only has about a year left to live, or less, as it turns
Mhm.
out. And so, what I found the most remarkable about him, I mean, and there are many tendrils to this, but the self-made nature of him. He had basically a few months of formal schooling maximum,
Mhm.
and ends up representing a district in Tennessee and in Congress 3 times, which is remarkable in its own right.
Right.
He was one of those guys who was farmed out as a bound boy at an early age by his father. He basically was an indentured servant on these wagoner roads, bringing goods across what was then called the West. And so he learned toughness and self-sufficiency and all of these traits that we come to admire in the American ethos. But was, I think, most dramatic to me and kind of remarkable is his ability. He clearly had some charisma that can't be taught. It's embedded in his character, because I opened the book with this really miraculous scene in which he's going to the theater in Washington, D.C. to watch a play called The Lion of the West, starring this fictional character called Nimrod Wildfire. And that character is clearly him. And so,
Right.
you have this really dramatic confluence of this actor portraying a character that is actually Crockett, and Crockett takes a bow in front of the stage, and you've got this man essentially meeting his own myth in real time. And I
Mhm.
call him, I guess you could give Benjamin Franklin a nod here for a run for the money, but I call Crockett the first celebrity in the sense that he was famous for being famous. He was well ahead of the Kardashians or
Yeah.
even Donald Trump, as it turns out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beyond that charisma in the book, you kept referencing he's just a positive dude. It's like, here comes all the calamities, all your big plans, years of work and thought and money that's been lent out. And he's like, well, here's what's going to happen next.
Yeah,
Positivity.
he was washed up. And I mean, the other thing is, yeah, his tenaciousness. I mean, he spent almost his entire life scrapping away to try to get out of debt. And every time he did, and he even, he had a lot of, we'll call it just chutzpah and a kind of nobility to him, because he paid off his father's debts in order to become kind of free from him at like 14. He spent 6 months working at a place to just get his dad's note clear so that then he could, help him out and move on. But a couple times he lost his, he had tried to create. He was never a very good farmer. He admits it himself. And he says he was better at growing children than crops. But he every time something happened, and he was either his grist mill and all his farm and house were washed down the river from building too close to the banks from a flood, or he lost this. He had this elaborate idea for this barrel stave venture where he was going to float. He did float 30,000 or something, the metal things that you hold wooden barrels together with, barrel staves down the Mississippi, and nearly dies and loses all his money. And then you're right, he would just sort of come out the other end and brush himself off, and usually with the support of a strong woman to say, look, you got to just keep going forward. And that was his motto, was go ahead. If be sure you're right, and then go ahead, meaning go forward. And so I really like that you touch on that, because we could all do with that. We're all going to encounter hardships and challenges, and it's what you do with them that matters.
Yeah.
Wow.
If he had found some success, if one of his ventures had worked out, would we even know who David Crockett was?
Man, that's a great question. I'm really glad he didn't, because he wasn't the kind of guy, like, based on everything that I read, who was really suited to be idle anyway. And so if the goal was, for some of the of his contemporaries to, get land, have other people work it and sit around, it really wasn't Crockett's MO. He admits in his autobiography that he was always sitting there at Congress, twiddling his thumbs, watching these and listening to these meetings drone on and on for hours, and he'd be like imagining being out hunting bears or turkeys or whatever. He just really was at his best and happiest when he was out on the game trails. And so I really don't imagine, even if he had found some kind of commercial success, I think, which is why he was going to Texas anyway, was to find some land to then start over. He was kind of a professional at starting over, reinventing himself.
Yeah.
Buddy, do you think where do you think the storytelling part of him came from? Did it just come from within, or were there seeds around him that kind of led to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think partly, I think the culture around the time was suited to storytelling as well, because the social structure included a lot of, and he spent a great deal of time, like I said, when he was young. First of all, his parents owned a tavern at one point, and so he would like be down in there doing work, and he's listening to people tell stories,
right,
where news and everything was really slow to get places. There was a lot of oral tradition of just spinning yarns and telling stories. And so he also had plenty of them of his own to tell by the time he finally returned home at like 16 from being out on the road. And he played this trick on his family where he'd been gone so long, and he ran away from school after he got in a fight with this kid. He sort of ambushed him on the side of the road and beat him up. And then his father learned that he had been truant for weeks on end. And so his father, who, I love the way Crockett phrases it, he liked to take a few horns, and his dad got kind of like wound up when he was drunk. And so he would drink horns of whiskey. And then when his dad learned that he hadn't been going to school, he and the schoolmaster both like set out to try to get him on the road. And he was so concerned about the beating he was going to get that he just kept running. And he ended up being on the road for years, and he came back, and he'd been like, working for various people behind oxen carts and horse-drawn carriages. And then he ends up the prodigal son returning, and he's got all these stories to tell. And he just sort of kept that rolling the rest of his life.
Yeah, it served him well everywhere he went. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, including, and I think where he really found his stride was in the campaigning. It's funny because he says that he never sought nor denied running for office. So like he was usually put forth by someone else who thought he would be good, you know. And it started out as just a small magistrate in a little Tennessee town. And it was funny because, you know, he basically was self-taught, you know, nearly illiterate, but was able to study long enough to be able to, you know, he would sign deeds or rule on property values or divorces or whatever. And then that just sort of snowballed to the point where eventually he was being put forth to run, you know, for higher and higher offices until he was going to be a representative for Congress. And with the storytelling on the stump was, I mean, it was really cool. You know, you think that politics are rough and tumble and mean spirited now, but like they kind of always have been. You know, when you hear the stories of what these guys would do, and they would make stuff up too, you know, about each other.
When you reach a point in your life when you almost died, and he has a number of these because he's an outdoors guy, he you know, kills a bear with his bare hands and all these things. But you get to these points where like there's apex danger and trouble. You just can't have any more and survive. Like when he climbs a tree 200 times in a night so he doesn't go hypothermic and die. This cartoon character comes to mind. When you have that, and I have a similar story. I was in a head-on collision on the Baghdad airport with an Abrams tank in a little tiny little van, you know? And so when certain things in life come to you that you're like, I should be worried about that, because you've been up here off the charts, you're like, I can't worry about that. I climbed a tree 200 times in a night, so I didn't freeze to death. And I survived that. So am I going to be worried about this other politician being mad at me or Andrew Jackson? Andrew Jackson climbed a tree 200 times in a night, you know, whatever, you know. But you get outside of the scope of reality sometimes. And I know it informs me in a good and a bad way about what is dangerous and what requires my full attention.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Crockett's scrapes with death are numerous. And, you know, it's funny, too, because when you're reading, obviously, I read not only his autobiography, but like every other book that had ever been written about him to date. And there have been a couple more since mine, I have to say. But you realize that, you know, obviously his yarn spinning it didn't stop at the stump on his campaign trail, but it leaks into his own telling of his own narrative. And of course, any memoir is going to be, you know, memory has only, you know, so much validity and truth. But I think the core of it, what is so remarkable about Crockett's own telling of his story is it's a true American classic. I think everybody should read it. Sure, he probably exaggerates a bit. But you realize, you know, and I have to say, I thought about this on one of my first dates with my future wife. I took her camping in the mountains at about 8,000 feet in October, and I was pretty ill prepared given where I was. And, you know, we got snowed on about 2 feet that night, and I didn't have a tent, a bivy sack. And I ended up having to, you know, give her my sleeping bag and everything. And I stayed up all night, breaking tree branches off, building a fire, and running up and down a hillside for about 5 hours to keep the blood pumping. And so when I read Crockett's account, I realized a lot of people are going to be like, well, he's just making that up. But he did what he could to stay warm, and he knew how to climb a tree. And he was like, climb up it and then slide back down it, so the friction of the bark on his chest would keep him warm. And I completely buy that, given that I, you know, completely blundered and spent a night, one of the longest nights, you know, trying to impress my girl.
Wow.
Yeah.
Buddy, was it hard to peel away the mythology and the facts, because he really did a lot of incredible stuff? I mean, he really did. But how did you handle that? How did you deal with that? Because he does cross that realm.
That's a great question too. These are all really interesting. I was very. I made certain that I did. So, as an example, one of the things that was really important to me was that during the research of the book, the Alamo movie starring Billy Bob Thornton came out, and I was. Yeah, I mean, that was right when I was drafting, and so I love Billy Bob Thornton, and I thought, oh my gosh, what a great Crockett he was going to be. But I made sure not to watch that movie until after I
Right.
was finished doing the research, because I wanted the Crockett in my head and the Crockett whose voice was coming through to me in all of the research and his own writings, to not be overrun and have, because Billy Bob is such a presence on stage and screen, that I knew that he would overtake the Crockett that I was kind of forming.
Right.
And
Historic.
also, the same goes for, I'm old enough to have been there in Southern California during the tail end of the Davy Crockett. We lived in about 15 minutes from Disneyland, and when that was a little earlier, I grew up there in the early to mid 60s, and but the Crockett craze,
Right.
which was significant. I mean, it was like put Ninja Turtles and Marvel basically to shame in a sense, because of the incredible monopoly that they had. I mean, Crockett was everything. And so that stuff was like still residual in my head, way later when I'm writing this book. And so you had to, what I tried to do was stick to what was known about him as a historical figure, and then not focus as much on everything that happened once Fess Parker became Crockett and Disney got a hold of the story, and stick to the historical record. And then I treat that other mythology of Crockett in the last chapter, because I do think it's important of how much staying power he had. But you're absolutely right. I try to look at 3 or 4 different versions of a particular story he might be telling, and sort of see which ones, how much of them hold up, and then look at other historical records, let's say of him in the Creek Wars and things like that. But yeah, it's always hard when a character or figure becomes so much bigger than life. I mean, and Crockett is I don't know if he's a household word today, but he sure was in the 60s and before.
Yeah, the almanacs and all that stuff. I mean, and like you said, the play with Nimrod. That's how big of a legend he already was.
But it's interesting too, Ron, and I wanted to ask you how you dealt with it, because the Alamo, this is such a historical event that took on, again, in a lot of ways, like Crockett, a life of its own after the siege. And I tried not to go down these rabbit holes, because there were some references to and people wanted to believe that Crockett escaped, and so I wondered how it was for you in focusing on Travis's slave Joe, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like there must have been stuff that also came out that you thought, I don't know if I believe that. And then you have to, like you said, you spent 11 years.
Yeah.
That's got me beat.
Most of that was I traced him all the way back to his birth in Kentucky and his original slave owner, and then through documentation was able to follow him to Texas. But as far as went with Crockett and getting to the Alamo, I mean, he had already been this iconic, American folk hero already then. But I just really tried to stay with the primary sources and the eyewitness accounts, and even those were, he was clearly a leader at that time, and I think the biggest challenge I had, and you probably know this for sure, but a lot of folks who study the Alamo, they are still debating to this day how he died, and and there's evidence on a lot of different angles to it. But that's probably the most controversial thing with him is, did he quote surrender? Did he,
Right.
And I read the part of, what you wrote, and I was wondering if you had any issues with that when you were going through it. Cause I mean, it's always,
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult because, especially with a figure, I mean, when you're touching on elements of patriotism and the desire to have a narrative that is heroic. I think a lot of people didn't want to see, I mean, because the way, if you buy the Mexican, basically, De La Peña's version of it, it's pretty inglorious for the end of these defenders because, Santa Anna ends up rolling in there and just saying, put them all to death. He had already said no quarter. And so in the end, I mean, it looks to me like, Crockett fought for as long as he possibly could. And then he's down to a handful, maybe 6 or something, survivors who maybe are thinking, well, we'll see what's going to happen. Crockett's not an idiot. If he figures out might be a way he can sneak out, he would try it. But then they're just, summarily executed and put into a funeral pyre. And so, I mean, at least that's how it was hard to write that last part because you're like, you want, and there are famous paintings of him going down swinging with the butt of his rifle, which aren't really rooted in the historical record, but certainly they did. I mean, the Mexicans did breach the walls. They were certainly in there. There would have been hand-to-hand fighting. There's no question about that. So, I guess you try to do as best you can and be able to be true to the record and not fabricate. That's sort of my litmus test.
Yeah, I try to stay on that lane too. It's like my friend says, she always says, this is what I think today based on the evidence I know now. Ask me tomorrow when new evidence comes in, because history can change with certain things. But the way I kind of dealt with it is I knew there was evidence that there had been some who were, brought forward at the end. I believe that. I believe Crockett could have been one of them. And my take may not be popular, but I think even if it was him that was one of them and was executed or went down fighting, and that when he realized that all was lost anyway, I think that almost makes it more heroic in a way, because to be one of the last men standing in that chaos and that battle, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
they were shooting anything that moved.
They were so outnumbered, and it all just happened so fast. It's an amazing, all those characters I really enjoyed when I was doing my research. I read 3 Roads to the Alamo by Davis, which is a very comprehensive account. And wanted to get to know. That's one of the difficulties of working on books the way I do, and then moving on, is that there are scholars who would have just moved right on to then writing something about Bowie or about Travis, because and Sam Houston, these people are all really interesting. But then I just move. My general tendency is to move on to kind of a new subject or area right afterwards. Though I have been on, like I said, I've been on the Arctic for 3 books in a row now. So I'm actually in the process of trying to move on from there. I don't know if I can.
I love the way you handled the whole Alamo thing and Crockett. I won't give it away, but I love the way you handled it. So it was. Oh,
I appreciate that. I'll look forward to snagging your book.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah.
Speaking of that, let me sell some books here. So the link for the book for Buddy here, I'll link myself in the big window here, right down here. And you guys know what I always say: buy 2, because then you can have a good time reading it with a friend. And look, here's the book. Look how cool this is. It's got a picture of David Crockett. You got a picture of the Alamo. All that stuff's good, and the compendium, so you can understand even more about Joe, the slave who became the Alamo legend. You can grab right there, and that'll be the book for Ron. And so, but we're here to talk about David Crockett. When you look at guys like David Crockett, Kit Carson, Daniel Boone, all these frontiersmen, all these beaver trappers, these are incredibly hard people. And they're just the ones we know about. What is it about that time that created these people that, for whatever reason, and I know some of this There's a belief that first sons got to stay home because they took over the farm and everything. The second sons might go into the clergy, but the third son, hey, you're going to have to go west and find something. And so they were sort of, a lot of them were kind of pushed out by a need to do something else. But what makes these men so incredibly resilient and tough? I mean, Kit Carson could walk across a desert and not drink water for days. It's amazing.
Yeah. By the way, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a fantastic book by Hampton Sides called Blood and Thunder, Kit Carson and John C. Fremont. And yeah, I've been intrigued by these guys. I mean, my dad gave me copies of Jack London's stories when I was a kid, and To Build a Fire and all the stuff in the Yukon. And, I just think that, I mean, partly there's a necessity to it. There were fewer roads, there were fewer creature comforts. People really knew how to do things back then. They knew how to navigate without maps by following game and Indian trails. They knew how to find water. They knew how to kill their own food, and they needed to support their families. I think we've been it's true that that technology has made certain kinds of travel improved, but I always feel the best. I mean, when I'm out and I don't have cell coverage, I don't have a sat phone. I mean, not necessarily the best, but the most alive. And I think there was something about being amongst, people who knew how to get shit done, who could who could protect themselves either from the wilderness, from nature, or from enemies. And there's a kind of there's a toughness that comes from doing that over and over and over again, where these people, like you say, I mean, they can walk. Guys like Crockett and Boone and and most of all the Native American peoples that they came into contact with could, I mean, day walks of over a marathon, and sometimes two, were not that uncommon if they were needed to either go get help or to go find food. And so the people were leaner, for one thing. They weren't carrying as much body fat around with them. And they were basically always training, essentially, because their lives were a kind of training. So they were strong as hell, and that goes for the women and children too. So I think we've kind of gotten, fat and weak as a group. Not you guys,
Let's be sure. Yeah.
Or your audience, or me. But you know what I mean. We rely on technology instead of our own wits, and it's. I think you can see it in the kind of stories that we read about folks where we're amazed, and we should be, and we should also try to emulate some of it. And I think there is a move to going back a little bit to more self-sufficiency, because, when you don't know how to build anything or do anything or find your way anywhere, if the grid goes down, you're going to be screwed, really.
Big time.
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah. Think about that.
Yeah.
Buddy, I was going
go ahead.
Go ahead.
You do.
No, go ahead. Okay. I did want to ask you this, because I came across this, and I actually did some research on it for fun. But there were a lot of stories about after Crockett died at the Alamo. And one of them that came out was that he was taken prisoner, sent down to Guadalajara, put into a salt mine. And I actually followed that rabbit trail just to see, because while I knew it wasn't him, I thought, there is a possibility it could have been somebody who was either at the Alamo or in the Revolution, was taken down there and was spinning this yarn because they knew that would catch an eye, that, I'm Crockett, saying they're Crockett. And it was so much believed at that time that was a possibility, that his son, John Wesley Crockett, had actually written letters down there that got down there where they could actually investigate that on some level, as best you could in 1838 or whatever.
Right.
And I was wondering if you had heard that story, and how maybe that speaks to this staying power that you talked about, about Crockett. Here we are 2 years later, and they're still talking about him being alive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you had the wherewithal to sort of continue down pulling on that thread because, I was trying to wrap up the book, and then I come across this allusion to the fact that there was a story about someone who had escaped and that or had been imprisoned, and was like yeah, like you say, in a mining camp of salt mine, right, or
Hmm.
something like that.
Yeah.
I can see how the perpetuation of or wanting the perpetuation of the Crockett story could easily live on because, like you say, he was really one of the most famous Americans of his day, and I
Hmm.
love the stories of when he was heading west. After he said, "If I lose this election, you all can go to hell, and I'm going to Texas,"
Yeah.
and
Great
and
book.
and
Great
people
book.
would line the streets of towns knowing he was coming. They'd hear from
Hmm.
other folks on horseback and moving back and forth that Crockett is coming. And I just love these images of him riding into a town and people are lining the streets really just to try to get to even touch him,
Yeah.
and get a peek at this guy. And so it doesn't surprise me that stories would persist. And it's true, as you know, from the chaos of the siege, that it's not impossible that someone would have, in the pre-dawn light, and even amidst all this cannon fire and rifle fire, that somebody could get away, or that he could have been imprisoned. So, I understand the desire for his story to live on, but I just didn't go all in on trying to figure out whether that was true. I just kind of figured it was a
Hmm.
story.
Yeah.
What did you determine?
I still think to this day, I think, and I don't want to go into it now, it's too long, but I do believe there was an American in a salt mine down there. And for whatever reason, he knew Crockett's name and was using Crockett's name. I mean, the only way I could prove it is
Yeah.
if I went down there and looked at maybe the, cemetery records or something,
Mhm.
or got a hold of the, legal
Well, and that,
documents. But
yeah, it's really interesting that John Wesley um, followed that up too, because he ended
yeah,
up becoming a congressman himself, and so he would
right.
have had at least some capability of getting information, and writing letters and finding out what was going on with his
Yeah.
dad.
And I have those letters. So
Wow, that's so great.
he really did that. But it kind of reminded me too, a little bit like, like Elvis or something, you don't want him to die and you want him to live on. And so these stories keep living on. I think there was another story about him hunting, and he was last seen in the Rocky Mountains hunting, and, but that was just the power of who, the famous Crockett, the
Yeah, I
celebrity
mean, when
Crockett.
you think about like listen, John Wayne played him.
Hmm. Yeah.
John Wayne, one of our, you don't get to be
Yeah.
much more of an iconic Western dude than that guy. He
Right.
played him. Um, Billy Bob played him. There were, like I say, Nimrod, Wildfire, and there were plays. And one of these, after I can't remember what the name of that one was, but it ran for like, you know, 18 years or something.
Wow.
Um,
I
and
didn't know that. I didn't
there
know
was a
that.
fascination. Yeah, there's a reference to it I think in the
Hmm.
epilogue of my book. But like, there was just an insatiable appetite for Crockettness,
Hmm.
for that went on for a really long time. And I think, partly we have so many more to, media is so different now that, they're just, there's more information. We're besieged
Inundated.
with it.
Yeah.
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 So in those days, he latched onto something and was able to really, really ride it, and he never discouraged people from believing the stories either,
Yeah.
even though he knew some of them weren't true.
Well, I'll tell you something. I've been very connected since 1997 to the Alamo community, historians, enthusiasts, hobbyists, and all the people from, you know, my generation and before that. Almost all of them were brought in by the Fess Parker. Like that's how they initially were introduced to the Alamo and to Crockett was through the best part of the days of the craze, as they call it. And I think that again speaks to the staying power that you talk about, of his legend.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I don't know that we'll see anyone quite like him, but I never say never, because history is weird that way. People have a way of surfacing in different realms, and then it's important that we remember. That's the other thing. I just love I'm so connected to the stories of like, Pete mentioned, the frontiersmen hold a really special place in my imagination, just because of how hard it was. And also what I love about Crockett's final move, and I think this is true of the frontiersmen and of Lewis and Clark, is that there's this unknown element to it, right? Where we don't know what's on the other side of that mountain range, and we're going to go find out, or we don't know what's down the river, or we're going to go there. And so I love that adventuresome spirit and the courageousness that it took to go places that. And Crockett, he knew that there was some settlement in Texas, but he himself had never been there, and so he's heading out and going west.
Yeah. If
there's go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just going to say, if there's something about Crockett that you think people should know or should remember, what is it that maybe stands out that you really would like people to remember about him?
Yeah, this is actually connected to what I was just saying, because there's this glorification in a way of the heading west, and I think it's important to remember. I mean, look, Crockett was alive during the during Andrew Jackson's infamous Indian removal bill, which resulted in the Trail of Tears. And so, we glorify, or at least sometimes we do. I find myself doing it, this manifest destiny and westward expansion. And we do have to remember that there were already people living there whom we were displaced, in the process of displacing. And so, and also performing a kind of, genocide for decades. And that's connected to what I think was really important about Crockett, because even though his grandparents were killed by Creek Indians, because, Crockett and his people who were coming, they were Scotch-Irish immigrants that were settling in what was then called the West, and were encroaching on native lands. His grandparents were killed by the Creeks. His father fought in the Revolutionary War over mountain men in North Carolina, I believe. And then, Crockett himself was hired on as a Tennessee mounted militia to go round up, so the term they used, Creek and other Indians that were being displaced during that time. And Crockett, so long way of saying, Crockett was the only delegate from Tennessee. I think he cast the only vote against the Indian removal bill. And so Crockett was a really complex person. Even though he had, as he put it, hunted up Indians down in Florida, and he had been in skirmishes, he had a great deal of respect for the Native American people because of their ability to live in the way he was actually trying to live, off the land, hunting and fishing for what you could consume and wear on your back, and carving out a small niche for yourself, and living pretty much in some kind of harmony with the natural world. And I really think that gets overlooked in all of the stories about the 105 bears he may have or may not have killed in one year. But Crockett really respected, if he came across non-combative Indians while he was out, he would nod and wave and move on down the creek and kind of give some leeway and go, "Hey man, we're both just here." And so I really think that's an unknown part of his character.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, when you do see these things that are of their time, obviously the annihilation and the poor treatment of Indians, the killing of 105 bears, if that's true, all these things, the trappers basically trapping beaver almost into non-existence, buffaloes, all these things. But those things happened in that time for a reason. And it's one thing to stand on principle today, with the comfort of air conditioning and everything else, but there was a life and death struggle. And if your grandparents were killed by Creek Indians, you do get to hate Indians for the rest of your life or whatever it is. Like, these are the things that happen. And by the way, if the Indians were like, we hate these people who are coming here, and they get to be pissed off to the point of murder as well. We tend to lose sight of what it meant to even live and survive back in that era, because it just wasn't that easy.
It was hard.
Yeah. I mean, the first recorded voices, like if you saw something, no one would ever see it again. If you met a person, no one would ever see that person again, because there was no photography for a long time. And even then it was a very simple thing. And the extremes between the world, we have this on the global scale now, but Behind Ron's Head is another great book he wrote about this really great prize fight that we're trying to make a movie out of. And these guys fought in 1889. Well, this is shortly after the gunfight at OK Corral and Tombstone. So in San Francisco, you got these dudes in tights fighting, right?
Yeah, bare knuckles.
And and then you got these guys who are riding on a vengeance. Wyatt Earp goes out on a vengeance spree and is murdering people, legally or not. All that stuff happens in the same world.
Well, this is
how complicated it was.
This is the one I love. Is in 1876 when Custer's getting killed at the Little Bighorn, cable cars are running up and down in San Francisco. That's a fact. Now, that's crazy.
Amazing, yeah. And you're only, I don't know, 750 or I don't know, maybe 1,000 miles away. It's it's a completely different world. Yeah. And so that's I found that Crockett's ability not to hold a grudge was quite unusual for his time. And I think it was just based on a great deal of respect. And for him, progress was he sort of scoffed at the landed aristocracy that was surrounding him. He was losing, or he was always electioneering against these guys who had way more money, and they wore the frilly frock coats and stuff, and he was like just kind of in his buckskins, or at least a lot more humble in his approach.
Buddy, you'll like this. This kind of goes with the theme of what you're talking about with Crockett. I've done some research and I wrote a couple articles on a frontier scout named Billy Dixon. And he was one of the buffalo hunters who was holed up when the Cheyenne and the Comanche and the Kiowa attacked the Adobe Walls. And he won the Congressional Medal of Honor in this other attack by the Kiowa in this little buffalo hollow where there was just a few guys, and they fended him off, and one got his leg shot off, and Billy carries him to the hole, and just amazing stuff. But at the end of his life, what turned out to be the end of his life, his wife had to finish his autobiography that he had been helping her talk about the stories. But one of the quotes, and I wish I could remember it exactly, but he was paraphrasing. He said, those of us who lived during those times and were in those fights and stuff, we never envisioned nor wanted the end of we never wanted this quote civilization. We loved the wild. We loved those days. They made us feel alive. They gave us zest for living, and he said it much better than I can. But that feeling was, and it kind of goes what you're saying. For that time period, they were living just to live, and it wasn't like he didn't have friends or respect, or maybe more respect for people that he was fighting 20 years earlier, on the frontier.
Wow, yeah, I love that. I'm going to follow up on and read. I can't wait to read your piece on this guy, Billy Dixon, huh?
Billy Dixon, yeah.
Sounds a really interesting guy.
Yeah. I thought his attitude was, and I've seen that with I've talked to Pete about this before, but people that you've actually had battles with and stuff, you're kind of tied in a bond in a way to blood bond,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm a big fan of, your enemy, and also the people that you're going to battle with, or just enduring hardship with. It creates a kind of brotherhood that can't really be emulated in many other ways, especially when the stakes are that high. It's one thing to play, a football game or a rugby match or whatever
Right.
I think you develop that to a degree, but not when life is on the line. That's not something altogether different.
Yeah. Maybe that's something Crockett understood.
Yeah. For sure. I want to change gears and wrap this thing up because I've got another show right after this one, and it's with a guy named, you guys are going to love this. His name is Richard Manley, and he is an illusionist. And his grandfather left him a log of all of his adventures. And I don't know if it was by design, but he's like left him this quest. And so this is another adventure guy that we're going to go on. He's got a show on Tubi. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but it's such a neat thing to have a grandfather say, I went to all these places in Oaxaca, fill in the blank, all these other places, and met all these people and had all these experiences. And we can still have adventures. We can still go out and do things. It's easier if you don't have a phone in your hand and you're not on a computer and you just go out and go do those things. You don't got to go to combat and get shot at, but you can go do a lot of really neat things. And so everybody go pursue those things. Ron, I'm going to let you close up your end, and then we'll let Buddy close up the whole show.
I appreciate it. I mean, seriously, Crockett that's an epic story. That's a heavy lift, and Buddy nails it. So, I mean, I really appreciate the time and your perspectives. That they give a freshness to this legendary American icon, American original. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey,
and Buddy.
Thanks, Ron. Ron, really great meeting you, and Pete, always a pleasure to be back on the Break It Down show. It's been fun talking about David Crockett, the man, the myth, the legend, and the icon. Once again, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, likewise. Let me wrap this thing up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you. But everybody, stand by in a few minutes. You'll get a new